The Nikon Z6 is a stellar camera. I really can't recommend it enough to anyone who wants to get into the Nikon full-frame video space and is also looking for a very capable camera for photography. At a price point of around $2,000 or usually $1,600 discounted, it could still be a very hefty investment for the enthusiast photographer who wants to go full frame but isn't doing so professionally. So when Nikon released the Nikon Z5, their new entry-level full-frame camera, I was really intrigued and wondered what you get, and I think more importantly, what you wouldn't get, at a price point of $200 less than the Z6 we've all grown to know and love. Thankfully, our friends over at Nikon PH reached out and helped me get my hands on one to play with and test out. So in this video, we're going to put this camera through its paces for all the things I like to do and see if it keeps up with my workhorse camera, the Nikon Z6. Let's get the first question out of the way and tackle what's different between the Z5 and the Z6. Here's a list of specs of the Z5, and it's largely the same as the Z6, except for a few caveats that Nikon have chosen to leave out or change in the Z5. Because I love making videos, the first spec change that really stood out to me was the video resolution. The Z5 can shoot up to 4K 30 frames per second, but with a 1.7 times crop versus the Z6's full sensor readout. It also maxes out at 1080p 60 frames per second at full frame versus the Z6's 1080p 120 frames per second. For video nerds like me, this is probably the biggest difference between the Z5 and Z6, but it's totally understandable because had they kept this the same, Nikon would cannibalize the Z6 or Z6 II's sales with the Z5. Moving on to other notable differences, this time in the realm of photography. The Nikon Z5 maxes out at a continuous burst rate of 4.5 frames per second versus the Nikon Z6's almost triple 12.5 frames. Again, this is something that Nikon chose to reduce to protect the Z6 and Z7 sales. For me, it's understandable though, because not everyone will need the crazy continuous burst rate at 12.5 frames per second, unless they intend to shoot sports or wildlife. Nonetheless, I brought the Z5 out to shoot some fast-moving cyclists and to see how it performs, which we'll get to in a minute. Now, it's not all doom and gloom with the changes between the Z5 and the Z6, because Nikon actually heard all our complaints with the Z6 and Z7 and put dual card slots in the Z5. The one caveat is that they're both SD cards instead of the CF Express on the Z6 and Z7. Honestly, this could receive mixed reviews because I know a lot of photographers who would love to stick to SD cards that they've been using for years and really hated the switch to a new type of memory card on the Z6 and Z7. So honestly, I wouldn't really stress over the type of card, but I do celebrate the presence of dual card slots. Some other changes they made from the Z6 to the Z5 is the reduction of the LCD resolution by half to 1.04 million dots, the lack of a backside illuminated sensor, the reduction of low-light AF sensitivity from -3.5 EV to -2 EV, and the removal of the top screen in favor of placing the mode dial to the right-hand side, a la the Nikon Z50. And yeah, that's pretty much it. Apart from that, it's basically got the same specs as the Nikon Z6. So now we've talked about the specs, let's get into the experience of shooting with the Z5 and see whether or not the reduction from the Z6 hugely impacts how I take photos and videos. Z5 out for portraits, I brought it to a studio shoot for an athleisure brand here in the Philippines. We only had a couple of hours for the shoot, so it was quite fast-paced, and I gotta say, the Z5 kept up pretty well. I synced it up to some strobes and shot most of the images at 1/200th of a second. Keeping in consideration the refresh rate of the strobes, the Z5 never really had any issues and shooting was really smooth. The autofocus was great, and tracking the model's eyes was really quick and I was able to track it from a further distance. I paired the Z5 with a Nikon 70-200 f2.8 VR2 via the FTZ adapter, and the autofocus was smooth and quick. Honestly, the experience was so similar to my experience with the Z6 that I almost forgot I was shooting with the Z5. All the buttons that I frequently use throughout the shoot are located exactly at the same places as the Z5's older brothers, the Z6 and Z7, that using it required zero getting used to, and I was really able to shoot at my best and most efficient. Another thing that I really loved about the Z5 and missed when I started shooting with the Z6 are the dual card slots. I set it up as RAW in slot 1 and JPEG Fine in slot 2. Because of this, I was able to hand off the second card to the organizers after the shoot, and to have redundancy if anything were to happen after the shoot. This really gave me peace of mind and made the post-shoot workflow so much smoother. Overall, for portrait photography, the Z5 really keeps up with all the higher-end cameras from both Nikon and other brands. There aren't really any features that you'd miss, and with the latest firmware updates on the Z5, you're able to have a more developed version of Nikon's mirrorless autofocus system at your disposal. Another area I enjoy shooting on the Z6 and Z50 is sports. Only this time, because of all that's happening in the world, I wasn't able to take it out to any basketball games to test. So I turned to my newfound, or rather refound sport, cycling. The wheel. This is a really good sport to test performance because not only do the subjects move across the frame, but they also move towards the camera, really putting the autofocus system to work. For this shoot, I put the Z5 in the highest burst mode that it was capable of, which was 4.5 frames per second. From the get-go, I hardly thought this was enough, and in practice, it really wasn't. I found myself missing the 12 frames per second of the Z6 and the blackout-free shooting experience. But just because the specs weren't up to par with what I was used to, that didn't stop me from getting great pictures. Having the same autofocus system as the more high-end Z cameras, tracking was great and really helped this not-so-good sports photographer get some pretty good shots. I stuck to mostly the box tracking, and I really like the update they had where after letting go of the shutter, the box would go back to where it started tracking to ready it to track another subject. Very cool. I used the Z5 on a video for a contest entry and shot a lot of the main sequences of that video on it. In well-lit situations, the video quality was on par with the Z6. I know this because I also used the Z6 to shoot some other scenes of that video, and they blended in really well together. However, I do have to note that while the Z5 can shoot up to 4K at 30 frames per second, it lacks super slow-mo shooting at 120 frames, and has a crop factor of about 1.7 times at anything higher than 1080p 60 frames. Was this a bit of a downer? Honestly, yes. I love my really nice and crisp 4K footage, but I hate the idea of having a crop and having to do the math to get the equivalent focal length I'd want if I were shooting on the Z6. Having said that, in the modes that it does share with the Z6, the video AF is practically the same and works the same way. The 90% AF point coverage makes AFF work flawlessly and tracks faces accurately. To further prove my point, let's take a look at some video AF tests I did with the Z6 and Z5 side by side. Oh, sorry guys, wait.
Yo man, I made you a grilled cheese.
Cool, thanks. Wow, look at that. Ooh. Oh. Oh my god. That is good. Where did you learn to make grilled cheese like this?
Funny you ask, because I learned on Skillshare.
Wait, as in the online learning community with thousands of inspiring classes for creatives and curious people?
Yeah, the same Skillshare where you learned your photography skills and deepened your passion and really got creative.
So you're saying they don't only have classes by Brandon Waffle and Jessica Kobesi about photography, but also have food-related stuff?
Yeah, I learned how to make the perfect grilled cheese from Ilana Karp's class. Did you know that you could use mayo instead of butter to make a more even toast?
Can you learn other things too, like how to make coffee?
Yup.
Beer?
Mm-hmm.
Baking.
Are you sure you're still not hungry?
So, the Skillshare that has no ads, which is curated specifically for learning, the one with new premium classes and is less than $10 a month with an annual subscription, has a ton of other classes, right?
Yup. They even have classes on how to take care of plants at home. Mom would love that.
Yeah, she would. Good thing Mom is always the first one to watch my videos because the first 1,000 people to click the link in the description will get a free trial of premium membership.
So you mean Mom will get 1,000 memberships because she's the only one watching your videos?
Touché. Okay, bye. I gotta get back to the review.
Later. Hey, Mom.
Alright, back to the computer. I did these tests with the respective kit lenses that the Z5 and Z6 come with. For the Z6, it's the Nikon Z24-70 f4 that we all know and love, and for the Z5, it's the new compact Z24-50 f4 to 6.3. I did a test at both the widest focal length and the longest that the Z5's kit lens could do, which was 50mm. First, let's start off with the lenses at 24mm. For this test, I had Alexa walk towards the camera and then duck out of frame to see how fast the cameras could lock onto her face and then onto the background. You can see in terms of tracking the subject moving towards the camera, both cameras perform identically. In the ducking test, however, the Z5 ever so slightly locks onto the background faster than the Z6. The difference is barely noticeable, but it's there if you put them side by side. I'd chalk that up to the newer firmware since the Z5 is a newer camera after all, and if you recall when I tested the Z50, it did seem to perform a bit better in AF tests than the older Z6. Now in this lateral test, you can see that the Z5 actually picks up the subject when she walked through the frame, whereas the Z6 didn't at all. Not gonna blame the Z6 since the subject was only in the frame for a couple of seconds, but it's impressive that the Z5 was able to pick up the subject and lock focus. This isn't a contest, but points to the Z5. Now let's put the lenses at 50mm. They're pretty much on par with each other in terms of tracking the subject moving towards the camera, and when we did the duck test again, you can see that the Z5 is just a tiny bit faster at switching between the subject and the background. Another thing I want to note is that both cameras had the same AF sensitivity and AF speed, so the test would be fair. Now for a running towards the camera test. And it's pretty much the same. So as you can see from the tests, the Z5's AF system and performance is pretty much on par, if not a tad quicker than the Z6's. It's good to see that just because it's more of an entry-level camera, in terms of autofocus, it performs equally with the more flagship cameras. Now let's do a stills AF test looking at how well the AF system and eye autofocus detection and tracking works. I had Alexa move towards the camera to see how far the camera could detect a face, as well as at what point it would switch to eye autofocus and track the eyes of the subject. As you can see, even if the subject is farther from the camera, Face AF is already engaged. And now it's tracking her eyes, and as she ducks out of frame, switches immediately to the background. Then her eyes, then the background, then her eyes. I like how quickly it goes to the eyes and skips the face tracking part. As she turns around, it loses her for a second, but as her face comes into view again, it quickly locks back on her eyes. In terms of eye and face autofocus, I'd say that it performs quite well, and will be able to handle portraiture, which is something I really look for in a modern day mirrorless camera. So should you get this camera? With more and more cameras available in Nikon's Z mirrorless lineup, this question has become a little tricky. Offerings like the Z6 and Z7 give great features at a slight bump for the Z6 and a rather considerable bump for the Z7, while the current latest and greatest flagship Z6 II and Z7 II are in a whole league of their own, at least price-wise. If you're an enthusiast or a semi-professional photographer taking on more and more jobs, looking to get your first entry into the land of full-frame cameras, the Z5 is a really good choice. It's got most of the features you'd enjoy from the Z6 to be able to shoot a wide range of genres, like portraiture, events, landscapes, and basically anything that doesn't require you to take more photos per second than you can review. The AF system is stellar and won't leave you jealous over your friends who opted for the bigger brothers in the Z lineup. Image quality is what you'd expect from Nikon. Sharp and detailed with great dynamic range and colors. Now if you're someone who wants to use your next camera for sports photography, wildlife, or anything that requires a faster burst rate, I'd point you in the direction of the Z6 or the newer Z6 II. From my experience, the 12 frames per second and blackout free shooting of those cameras proves to be indispensable to get the job done, and done in a fun way. Sure, you could dabble in those fields with the Z5, but if you're gonna do so on any kind of regular basis, I'd urge you to spend the extra cash and go for the bigger brothers in the lineup. If you're a hybrid shooter, I'd recommend the Z6 over the Z5. From my experience, I really missed having the full frame image when shooting 4K. The 1.7 times crop was something I didn't want to have to deal with, so I found myself shooting at 1080p 60. And although I don't always shoot super slow-mo videos, when I do, I find that feature extremely useful and was something I was looking for on the Z5. Even if I don't recommend the Z5 in those certain scenarios, it's not a knock against the camera itself. I totally understand that Nikon has selectively opted some features out to create a differentiation between the cameras in their lineup. Moreover, after some time with the Z5, it's pretty clear to me now who their target market is with this camera. Enthusiast photographers looking for their first foray into full-frame mirrorless, and maybe even professional photographers looking for a second body that performs similarly, if not identically, to their Z6 or Z7. I think I fall in the latter category because I just gotta say, working with the Z5 was an ease. There was no having to learn the camera and controls at all. I picked it up, put on my lens, and got shooting. So yeah, at the end of the day, this is really a photography-centric camera with some sprinkles of video features. So if that's what you're looking for, this is the camera for you. So yeah, that's about it. I hope you guys enjoyed this video and found it useful. If you have any other questions about the Z5 or anything related, leave a comment down below and I'll try my best to get back to you as soon as possible. That's about it for this video. See you next time.